Bishop. I'm the Academic Services and Programming Manager for LASI's, and I want to thank you all for coming today. We're going to circulate some paperwork that we'd like you to sign in if possible, if you haven't signed in already, just so we can keep track of attendance for the luncheon. I also want to thank Janelle Anderson. I don't think she's in the room now, but she handled a lot of the logistics for the lunch and AV and whatnot for today. So thanks so much for coming. I'll turn it over to Kata, our faculty director, to introduce our speaker.
All right, again, hello everyone. Thank you so much for coming. We have a great pleasure of having here today with us Paula Unger, who came here from very far away from Colombia. She works there in Humboldt Institute, the National Center for Research on Biodiversity, where she leads research on environmental conflicts. So her work is on the interface of academia and policy making around conservation, and she's been doing this work for more than 15 years now. So she works with NGOs, national parks, and obviously the Institute, and she publishes analysis of conservation initiatives aimed at informing environmental policy and constituting methodological guidelines for environmental practitioners. So she works on issues such as what is territory, what is an ecosystem, and how to establish where it begins and it ends, taking into consideration not only Western science, but also indigenous people's knowledges and epistemologies. She also publishes critical reflections on her work from different perspectives, such as in the essay, "The Mountains We Touched, the Role of Care in Defining Ecosystem." So I met Paula in Richard Carson Center in Munich in 2017, and she was giving a paper in a work in progress seminar that really touched me very deeply as very significant for the issues that we all work in, very beautifully written, and importantly, very deeply interdisciplinary. So for me, Paula has been this kind of ideal scholar, very much in agreement with what LASI's would like to be, interdisciplinary or maybe even transdisciplinary, because she focuses on the issues that need solutions, and then she draws from different knowledges, academic and non-academic, to see how these issues should be best solved. So without taking more time, please welcome Paula.
Thank you, Kata, very much for that undeserved introduction. So yeah, first of all, I want to thank Kata and Liz Hennessy, who's not here, for inviting me to Madison. It's so wonderful to be able to see you again. And what I will present today is a reflection on research I carried out and my friend Julia Bremauer while we were doing our PhDs in Colombia many years ago. Although, yeah, many years have passed, some of our findings only made sense many years later when we had the opportunity to think through them under the light of environmental cultural studies, thanks to the invitation by Kata to participate in an edited volume that is coming out soon. So that was our chance to make relationships between nature's practices, power visible through storytelling, something that the conventional socio-ecological studies in which we were framing our PhDs do not usually allow or invite you to do. So I want to especially thank Kata for inviting me to be part of that project. Julia and I met while we were both doing our PhDs in these two very different places. She was working in the Caribbean deserts of the Guajira Peninsula in the extreme north of Colombia, the lands of the Wayuu people in the Macuira National Park. I was in the southern Amazonian lowlands, the lands of the Ticuna people in the Amacayacu National Park. They are literally, I will show you later in a map, in the extreme corners of the country. However different these places might be from National Parks headquarters in Bogota, they could be seen as relatively similar. Amacayacu is this one, this national park here, and Macuira is up there on the tip of the peninsula. Are two of what back then were 54 national parks, neat shapes on a map covering about 12% of the country's surface. In this same map, there are shapes in a different color, the gray, the darker gray ones, which cover around a third of the country. They are resguardos, indigenous territories legally recognized by the state, where collective land tenure has been granted to many of the around 87 officially recognized indigenous peoples in Colombia. In these resguardos, indigenous people hold the right to govern themselves. They are like public authorities. So in the places where national parks and resguardo coincide, which are known in national park, in parques nacionales, in the institutions as overlapped parks, there were 29 national parks back then. They have, like, national parks authorities and indigenous peoples have to agree on the management of their shared jurisdictions, and they subscribe what national parks officially has called special management regimes, that is, written agreements on how the land is going to be managed. So two forces are in tension when co-government agreements are negotiated: the need to conserve nature, a threatened non-human entity as presented by science to the modern state, and the vindications of the indigenous socio-natural worlds that take place in these territories. It was in this field of tensions where we were both doing our research in radically different places. Particularly, I am going to talk about today is the role played by local officers, local park officers, that are the ones who more directly deal with these tensions, or, as I will try to show, perform a particular kind of dance to the different rhythms that these tensions produce. Maybe in this situation, what first comes to mind, especially to those of you trained in political ecology, is to follow in which ways the central state, allied with science, has imposed worldviews and practices on local understandings of natures, for having territorial control. However, our experience showed us things that were closer to what Juanita Sundberg, among others, but she found it in the Maya Biosphere Reserve and described as encounters, as contestations, resistance, but most of all here, negotiations and appropriation. Furthermore, we argue that these mediations, these dances led by local officers, permitted the eruption of what Marisol de la Cadena might call earth beings, that is hybrid, non-human, human, non-metaphysical, and metaphysical entities into conservation politics. These earth beings, as Marisol calls them, that appear in national parks are, however, particular. In the end of this presentation, I will suggest in which ways we feel they might be different to what she describes as earth being. So, how were these places where we were working? Amacayacu is one of the Colombian Amazonian parks, the one that is easier to reach in the region. You travel from Leticia, the departmental capital, on a 2-hour boat ride along the shore of the immense Amazon River, and you get there. It was founded in the early 1970s, among other things, to gain control of the country's borders with Peru, Ecuador, and Brazil, and to eradicate the growing coca business in the region. The facilities of the park are a series of stilt houses connected to the river through a harbor. When I was there, 15 local officers were there in charge of this immense territory of 290,000 hectares. One of them was Alberto Parente, that's him, a tall, thin, silent Ticuna man. The Ticunas are one of the ethnic groups that have inhabited the Amazonian lowlands for around 10,000 years. In the last century, along with other Amazonian peoples, they were subjected in different ways to the consecutive rubber, fir, timber, coca booms. and they were often displaced from their original territories, and their traditional knowledge of their land has been radically transformed in many cases. Over the last years, since the park, mainly since the park opened its doors for ecotourism, Ticunas have also become tour guides, sellers of crafts, and providers of food and transportation for tourists in the park. Since the 1980s, all 5 indigenous settlements that are in or around the park, most of them housing people from different ethnic origins, are part of the 3 resguardos, which amount to slightly more than 1/10 of the park's area. So this is the park, and this is the 3 resguardos that were created after the park was created. Okay. So Alberto was with me in some of my walks through the park. I remember the first day I arrived, we crossed creeks and circled marshes, surrounded by one of the most diverse spots in the Colombian Amazon according to some biodiversity studies. And he indicated the level to which these water bodies would shrink in the coming summer, like every year. The big lake at the end of the path, where I could make out the fleeting backs of a couple of pink dolphins, would then contract, and most swamps and ponds would totally disappear to give way to dry patches, paths, grasslands, and beaches. The landscapes and all the visible and invisible connections between Amazonian beings change profoundly twice a year, with the change between aguas bajas and aguas altas. There is a difference of around 10 meters in the depth of the Amazon River between these 2 moments in the year. While I was in Amacayacu, Julia was in the other extreme of the country. Macuira is a miraculous oasis in the middle of an immense desert. A small isolated mountain range of 25,000 acres. It's been regarded by scientists as unique because it's a biogeographical island where dozens of species migrating birds rest every year, of migrating birds. Macuira is also the center of mythic origin of the Wayu people. The park facilities are located in Nazaret, a small village at the boundary of the park. Except for the park facilities, a hospital, and a boarding school, all other buildings are Wayu family houses. The 250,000 Wayus are the most numerous indigenous people in Colombia. The peninsula de La Guajira is since the 80s also primarily resguardo land. So I don't know if you can see here that all this is resguardo, and the park is a small patch inside the indigenous territory. As I will go into a bit more detail later, for the Wayu, the worlds of the dead and the worlds of the living are very strongly related in everyday events, and these and other Wayu worlds are connected to dreams. So in both of these 2 very different overlap parks, some members of the park staff were indigenous men and women, or people who had been living in those places for decades. You can see that's a Wayu man who's wearing the ranger's uniform. Wearing the institution's uniforms and getting paid by the state, and also living in the land of their ancestors, where they grew up, where their children are born, where their food is cultivated, and they're dead at birth. They negotiate the idea of a national park and its management through their everyday localized practices. So, how did these mediations happen? One of the most noticeable things that both Julia and I realized while following the management of the parks was the tension between the times of the central state bureaucracy in national parks and the local times. As part of their regular duties, local park officers are in charge of convening meetings requested by national or regional headquarters with indigenous communities. In Bogota, the national government's goals are translated into working plans and deadlines and carefully squeezed into desktop calendar slots. These modern grids, are then sent to the local officers who have to make them come true in territories where the pace is set by nature's rhythms and people's material and spiritual connections to them. So for instance, in La Guajira, first and second wakes and funerals determine Wayu calendars and are the core of systems of reciprocity and redistribution. When a person dies and is buried for the first time, She remains in Helpira, a place of abundance where the dead live and communicate regularly with the living through dreams, until the second burial is performed a number of years later. For Wayu people, life consists of a continuous chain of reciprocal favors, and according to strict rules of funerals and wakes, the distribution of the livestock that belong to the deceased support the cosmic cycles and an economy based on reciprocity. Therefore, the funerals and the yearly seasons for second funerals have to be excluded from possible meeting dates with national representatives, as do the weeks of the mourning following a death. That's just one of the many situations in which it's just not possible to follow the guidelines by the central, given by the central offices. For Southern Amazonian indigenous people, a meeting cannot be planned independently of seasons of rain and drought, times of flood, and times of harvest. In Amacayacu, it is impossible to reach the communities living in the northern part of the park in times of aguas bajas, where you would need to carry a boat on your shoulders along the dry kilometers of the route for crossing the otherwise flooded lands. In the rainy season, people might be busy harvesting fruits from the forest or hunting puercos de monte or cerrillos that feed on these fruits while escaping from the flooding of the lowlands. In the dry season, they might be occupied cultivating short-lived species as yellow yuca, maize, watermelon, or ají dulce in the ephemeral river margins. Therefore, organizing a meeting is a slow and complicated process that has to be tuned to local rhythms. Tensions between Parques Nacionales headquarters and local officers often arose because of the importance of respecting local times for the planter. Both in Macuira and in Amacayacu, local staff more than once denied the regional director a meeting with traditional authorities because the timing was just not right. Thus, the world of Parques Nacionales, of course, arrived in these territories enabled by local officers, but it was made clear that the dance of governance would take place at the pace set by indigenous socio-natural worlds. Another realm in which local officers mediated between different worlds was that of politics. Here I mean for now human politics. It is in their hands to decide how to bring the institution's abstract and standardized ideas of participation and management to the complexities of each territory. That is, they decide whom to engage in participatory processes, how to do it within local hierarchies, gender relations, power tensions, and ways of communicating. So that, as an officer told me, the right voices are included in the right ways. The right voices for indigenous worlds and bringing them into conversations with Parques Nacionales. For instance, in Macuira, 54 Wayu chiefs, one from each independent customary family territory in the park area, constitute a wise men council. As part of the construction of the special management regime, for the discussions around any agreement, 4 meetings on consecutive days had to be held, each covering a quarter of the park area with the participation of all Wayu chiefs. While Julia was in the park, Wayu staff members opposed attempts by the participation office in Bogota to reduce the meetings from 4 to 2 and with just some of the chiefs to save time and money. The staff did not accept this because, as one staff member put it, the central office is now trying to establish a participation strategy that only takes into account what is best for the Ariguna. Ariguna are the white people in Wayu. The idea to have 4 meetings was to have all the territories represented while sparing the chiefs long distance travel and avoiding enemy clans from meeting. So the meetings took place and eventually the agreements were subscribed by all clans and signed by them, whereas the local officers intended including the right voices, even if this meant not complying to times established by the central office or having to find additional financial support. Officers in Bogota, sometimes with resentment and sometimes with respect, were well aware of this position of local officers. One of them told me once, "We call it the taxi dog syndrome. They tell you yes, but they actually often don't, simply because maybe what one proposes from here is not useful there." So with the taxi dog, he was referring to a common kind of decoration found in taxis in Bogota or in many Colombian cities. They are miniature stuffed dogs that have a spring inside their necks, and while their feet are firmly glued to the surface of the dashboard, their head moves with the movement of the car. So while keeping their feet on the ground, by what they perceive as what needs to be done in the territories, local officers also comply with the national institutions' formalities. So they manage to be this, to play both games, but always keeping their feet on the ground and doing what they feel needs to be done for their territories. So the argument that I presented in the beginning mentioned the idea that all this mediation was so that hybrids could take part in the management of the park. So what did we mean with hybrids? I'll just give you 1 minute to read this. So this is how a local officer instructed biologists to do their vegetation studies in the 3 peaks of the Serranía, which is in the picture back there. For biologists, this place is unique as it is the only example of a dwarf cloud forest at 1,000 meters altitude. In the Andean region, these kind of forests are usually above 2,300 meters, more or less. The studies were needed in order to include these forests in the park management plan and in the special management regime. So the studies were indeed carried out with these conditions, with these instructions, following these instructions, and the dwarf cloud forests became part of the park's special management regime, which was signed by the General Director of Parques Nacionales and had the fingerprints of most of the traditional chiefs. The document starts with the following quotation in both Spanish and Wayunaiki of the creation of Macuira by Huya, the father of earth, and his offering of all beings of that land to his beloved wife Pulowi. It says, "All animals and plants that exist in these territories are for her." Among the presents given to Pulowi were what science calls dwarf cloud forests and their species, which are included as sacred zones in the park's zonation, along with water springs and cemeteries. In them, only spiritual and cultural activities by the Wayu are allowed. So, translated as sacred zones, and after a negotiation that took place in Wayu terms between scientists and the Wayu owners of nature, mediated by local officers, Pulowi's presents to his wife made it into the park's management plan. In Amacayacu, in the Amazonian Park, as part of the construction of the management plan, a list of conservation objects needed to be established, as in all other national parks in the country, in order to define priorities for monitoring, funding, research. According to the institution's official guidelines, these conservation objects had to be a limited number of attributes of biodiversity, ecosystem services, or natural attributes of cultural value. Examples such as endangered species, carbon regulation, or sacred sites were given to them in the guidelines. These could be seen as examples of how to reduce local worlds to a scientifically legitimate representations for modern politics. This framework was felt to be misleading by local officers. For them, what was really indicative of conservation were the processes. They refused to use the idea of objects that connected culture and nature, the processes that could signal the well-being of the people and their regulatory systems around which conservation agreements could be met. A local officer told me what an indigenous woman who participated in a workshop told her. First, there is no word for us that means environment. For us, what needs to be conserved is people. If I take care of myself, of my body, then I'm taking care of where I cultivate, I'm taking care of where I hunt, I'm taking care of where I fish. I watch that the sabedor communicates with the spiritual owners and asks for permission, because if that doesn't happen, there is illness for me and for everybody. So in Amacayacu and in other Amazonian parks, local officers proposed to replace conservation objects with integral conservation priorities. Among the most important integral conservation priorities were chagras, chart. Here is a drawing by an indigenous woman from a different region in the Amazon, but also from the lowlands in the Amazon. Chagras are itinerant orchards where an extraordinary diversity of tubers, fruits, and medicinal plants are cultivated in sophisticated spatial arrangements that represent social and gender relations. The quality of a chagra reflects the community's inherited understanding of the natural history of species and varieties, of climate cycles, of ecological relations, and of how to communicate with the spiritual owners of the forest, who have to give permission for the curación, the healing of the land. Parques Nacionales, the institution, initially resisted making integral conservation priorities official, and there was a long struggle to impose conservation objects in all management plans in the country. Years later, however, they were adopted as part of the institution's national guidelines for overlapped national parks. So up to this point, I hope I've been able to communicate what I announced at the beginning. On the one hand, parks are not only sites of the establishment of hegemonic understandings of nature and marginalization of local people. Categories such as state officers and local communities are not natural and not static. Conservation discourses are reconfigured all the time. And the work of these local officers allows new hybrids to walk into human conservation policies. Sacred forests where dreams dwell, chagras where plants that are men and women bear their fruits, walk into Parques Nacionales, defying the fundamental commandment of conservation's agenda, that is the division of nature and culture. Although this was illuminating, we still felt it did not fully convey the particular role of these local officers, which we felt was somehow different to what Marisol de la Cadena explained about her friends' roles in Peru. More specifically, what we felt was that the conditions in which these earth beings were conjured here were different. National parks are places of encounter, and local officers are in unique positions in these places. It was only when I was finishing the essay that this difference was made more visible to me by old friends. So this will sound a bit unbelievable, but I swear this is what happened. One evening, while I was struggling to name these particularities of national parks' earth beings, the doorbell rang unexpectedly in my house. Two Amazonian park officers, old friends from the time of my PhD fieldwork, came to visit me by surprise. We had kept in touch, but we met at most once every year. Who would believe this coincidence? I said when I opened the door and mentioned what I was working on. Do coincidences even exist? Asked Edgar with his funny, cynical tone. He lived more than 15 years in the Kawinari Park, which is another Amazonian park, with the Miraña people. That's in the northeastern part of the Colombian Amazon. Hernan, my other friend, looked out the window and smiled. He's now working in Yaigojea Paporis, which is another Amazonian national park that was declared following a request made by traditional authorities of 7 indigenous peoples to Parques Nacionales. So that's a park that was declared because indigenous people asked the state to declare a park there. The 3 of us drank beer and they told me about how things have changed in the Amazon since I last visited. Most Amazonian national parks were subject to the boom of illegal gold mining of the end of the last decade. This picture is not in Colombia, but I thought it was beautiful and dramatic, and that's why I put it here. It's in the Venezuelan in southern Venezuela, but it's also like a strong mining intervention. Most Amazonian national parks were subject to the boom of illegal gold mining of the end of the last decade. Excavators occupied the rivers, stirring the sand, destroying the beaches where tortoises lay their eggs, and flooding the water with mercury. Many indigenous men became miners and left their land when the excavators left. Many young women became prostitutes. Almost apologizing, I explained what I was writing. I wondered aloud whether these maybe romantic ideas still made sense. So many years later, so many changes later. Edgar and Hernan decided to explain to me the pulses of the territory, their latest idea. Hernan put it like this. That role of local officers is not always easy. You have to be accountable to both Parques Nacionales and paisanos, that is, indigenous people. you're walking a thin line, and sometimes you are looked at with suspicion from both sides. And you have it clear that you're not going to impose things on people, but sometimes before you mature, you go to the other extreme